Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we track the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. It was indeed a Super Tuesday for both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Each won 7 states. Trump proved he has broad support from the liberal Northeast to the Deep South. Clinton proved she could build a national coalition. She won over Bernie Sanders near 2-1 from Virginia to Texas and even edged him out in liberal Massachusetts. Bernie won 4 states, including Colorado, and vowed to press on. Ted Cruz won his home state of Texas, neighboring Oklahoma, and Alaska. Marco Rubio only won Minnesota, diminishing his chances of becoming the Trump alternative. Though Trump still has 1,000 delegates to go before he would clinch the nomination, he decided for last night at least to start looking more presidential. Instead of the usual raucous celebration, he held a news conference before a stand of American flags at his own private club, Mar-a-Lago, in Palm Beach, Florida. Asked how he would deal with a fractured GOP, he said,
"We have expanded the Republican Party. When you look at what's happened in South Carolina and you see the kind of numbers that we got in terms of extra people coming in, they came from the Democratic Party or the Democrat Party, and they're Democrats and they're longtime Democrats and they were never going to switch, and they all switched, and they were independents. And we've actually expanded the party. Look at the number of votes we had in that area as an example. 4 years ago, they had 390,000 or so votes. We doubled it. We were almost 800,000. Whereas the Democrats went down. There's much less enthusiasm for the Democrats. So, look, I'm a unifier. I know people are going to find that a little bit hard to believe, but believe me, I am a unifier. Once we get all of this finished, I'm going to go after one person. That's Hillary Clinton, on the assumption she's allowed to run, which is a big assumption. I don't know that she's going to be allowed to run.
In contrast, Clinton chose not to suggest that Trump was a criminal. At her Miami victory rally, she did mock Trump's signature slogan, saying, "America has never stopped being great," she said, and instead that America needs to be made whole again.
Instead of building walls, we're going to break down barriers and build ladders of opportunity and empowerment so every American can live up to his or her potential, because then and only then can America live up to its full potential too.
Later, Trump said he didn't know what that Make America Whole thing meant. He also mocked Marco Rubio, calling him the little senator. Trump was asked repeatedly about his delayed and less than forceful disavowal of support from former KKK leader David Duke. Both Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and House Speaker Paul Ryan had earlier upbraided Trump about this. Ryan saying the party of Lincoln, quote, does not prey on people's prejudices. Trump's response?
Look, I don't want to waste a lot of time. I've disavowed. Okay, I'm going to get along great with Congress, okay? Paul Ryan, I don't know him well, but I'm sure I'm going to get along great with him. And if I don't, he's going to have to pay a big price, okay? Okay.
Tough talk. Ryan, by the way, has already said he will vote for Trump over Hillary if Trump is the candidate, despite his differences on the Klan. So how clear is it that in November it will be Donald versus Hillary? Well, come from behind wins are always possible. Yes, time for the horse race. What else did we learn from Super Tuesday? Well, that the two parties are on opposite paths. Democrats coalescing around a candidate, the GOP still at war with itself. Though Donald Trump's 7-state win was impressive, none were by majorities, rather pluralities. His average take remained at about 1/3 of Republicans turning out to vote. And he lost in 4 states, as Ted Cruz took home victories in Oklahoma, Texas, and Alaska. Rubio won Minnesota. To Trump's opponents, the fractured field itself began to look like a possible antidote. While Rubio became weaker last night, Ted Cruz became stronger, finally delivering the evangelical base he's been promising. Cruz, now at 226 delegates, has more than twice Marco Rubio's, and they put him within striking distance of Donald Trump. but can Cruz widen his appeal among moderate voters in upcoming states? And is Rubio truly that weak? One area where he does tend to shine is among voters in inner-ring suburbs. In Virginia, he had a chance to overtake Trump and notch an actual win. But John Kasich, competing for the same demographic, appears to have stolen his thunder. Also playing a part in Rubio's frustration, he failed to meet minimum vote thresholds, so was denied any delegates in Alabama and Texas, despite his competitive numbers in each state. For Democrats, Super Tuesday continued to clear the path for Hillary Clinton. Unfortunately for Bernie Sanders, his delegate deficit will likely continue in the absence of his making inroads among African Americans. Hillary Clinton continued to pummel Sanders in that key demographic, and Sanders remains weak among Hispanics, affluent whites, and older voters. Further obstructing Bernie's path is an endorsement wall that just continues to get higher. To date, Hillary Clinton has received 478 endorsements from elected officials from her party, while Bernie Sanders has accumulated just 5. All right, time to discuss the big picture. In light of Super Tuesday, joining us, Demos Fellow and former New York Times columnist Bob Herbert, and National Review Institute Buckley Fellow Ian Tuttle. Nice to see both of you again. Thank you very much for coming. Before we give the nominations to Clinton and Trump, here are the actual numbers in the Republican presidential race. You need 1,237 delegates to clinch the nomination. Trump now has just 285. Cruz 161, Rubio 87, Kasich 25, and Carson 8. In other words, for all the hype, Ian, about how super yesterday was for the front runner, Trump is still 1,000 delegates away from clinching the nomination. Are we in the media overhyping how big his lead is?
Probably to a certain extent. It's not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. You know, only a small number of states have voted. The outcome yesterday, though, does suggest that the two paths are probably the two prospective paths for the anti-Trump forces have probably converged into one path. It looked prior to Super Tuesday like perhaps we could gain some sort of outcome in which it would clarify one single anti-Trump opponent, and Republicans could consolidate around that opponent. Everybody yesterday, besides Kasich and Carson, made reasonably good cases that they should remain in the race. It's Cruz and Rubio. So now it looks like we have a sort of de facto favorite son path going forward where
Rubio wins his home state, Florida. Kasich wins his home state, Ohio. Cruz already did it in his home state, Texas. Right. Bob, do you agree that instead of coalescing behind one anti-Trump candidate, that the path is now for them all to stay in, gather a few delegates here, a few delegates there, and hope they arrive at the convention without Trump having gotten an actual majority? I
do agree. I mean, the plan is to stop Trump, not necessarily to defeat Trump, you know, before they get to the conventions. But I think the Republicans have an enormous problem either way now because of that. Either Trump gets the nomination, which is probably the most likely occurrence. But the other alternative is if the so-called GOP establishment just sort of gets together, however they do it, to stop this Trump train on the way to the nomination. If that happens, the civil war that's already roiling the party really gets out of control. And you know, I can't imagine what would happen then, but all of it would be bad for the GOP.
Yeah, well, let's imagine what that might be, or even in the very short term, what that might be. Jeff Greenfield writes on Politico, what this amounts to and requires is the kind of total repudiation that is virtually non-existent in American politics. Do you even know what that would look like?
I don't. I mean, I think the party would fracture before our very eyes. There would be a chance that they would, I imagine that they would try to run a third-party candidate. That would give the election to the Democrats. But also the party would have to redefine itself going forward because it wouldn't be the kind of split that you could easily heal. the folks who are supporting Trump, and there are many of them, would be so enraged that I don't think that there'd be a way to accommodate them going forward.
Ian, there already is this total repudiation of Trump in print in your magazine, National Review. So what do your colleagues over there think the path is going forward to stop him?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and no one's underestimating the enormity of the task. The fact is that we think, I think I can speak for the magazine on this point, that this is existential for not simply sort of the Republican Party as currently constituted and as a vessel for a certain view, but for the principles and ideas that the Republican Party, we believe, has stood for. So that means that everyone against Trump who has a dime to spare should be putting up attack ads in Florida and Ohio. We need the media rallying behind Rubio and Kasich and Cruz to the extent that they might change late-coming voters' minds.
Let me stop you for a second.
Yeah.
You said what's at stake is all the values that the Republican Party has stood for. I have a feeling the two of you both really want to stop Trump, but to reinforce very different values in this country. Can you talk about that, and just maybe the two of you compare notes? Why do you think Trump is dangerous?
I think Trump is dangerous because he is such a divisive figure that he plays to the fears and the worst instincts of a lot of Americans, that he encourages racists, that he wants to have a religious test on test for people coming into the country, and for any other number of reasons. Among the biggest being that he doesn't understand the major issues facing the country. In one of the earlier debates, here was a guy who did not understand what the nuclear triad was in this country, and he's supposed to be the commander-in-chief. He'd be a catastrophe. But I also think that the Republican Party is reaping what it has sown for many decades now. The Republican Party, sometimes with a wink and a nod and sometimes not, has encouraged people who have been some who have been out and out racist, others who have been hostile to the interests of minorities in this country, and others who have been just sort of mean-spirited on a lot of issues, thinking that they could control those voters. Now those voters have sort of slipped out of control.
And so why do you think Trump is dangerous, or why do the editors of National Review think so?
Well, for a number of the reasons that Bob cites, and I I don't want to get into too much diagnosis, because I think that at the end of the day, there are a lot of things that get very difficult when you get right down to it, into why exactly Trump has risen to the extent that he has. But the basic idea for us is that Trump is openly hostile to constitutional and small r Republican government. I mean, this is a man who came out just the other day and said that he wants to open up libel laws so that he can sue journalists who write, quote, hit pieces about him. There's just a nasty authoritarian streak in him that is absolutely antithetical to the types of limited and local government that conservatives have been pushing for decades. That we at National Review think we've tried to popularize.
So do you think there's maybe a little bit of overlap between why progressives fear Trump becoming president and why conservatives do?
Oh, no, I do, because I think on fundamental issues and values in the United States, I mean, I think there is convergence on liberals, moderates, and conservatives in this country. You don't want to tear apart our best values. We are supposed to disagree on policies, and you can disagree vigorously on that. So I agree with Ian that Trump goes to the heart of some of the fundamental values of this country, and both sides can agree that that's not a good thing.
Bob, when Trump says Clinton's phrase, "Make America whole again," which is in response to his "Make America great again," that she doesn't even know what that means.
He doesn't know what that means.
He claims that she doesn't even know what that means. Do you know what that means?
Yes, I know exactly what that means. We've come through, for example, I mean, there are a lot of problems with this country in terms of people getting along, getting together, and that sort of thing. But we've come through almost 8 years of a Barack Obama presidency, which in the beginning people were saying maybe we were even in a post-racial period in this country. That turned out obviously not to be true. But there is a level of hostility towards African Americans, other minorities, Muslims in this country, and what you want to do is sort of bring people together. That's what Hillary's talking about when she's talking about make America whole again. Trump's whole campaign is based on the idea of pitting groups against one another. So this is one of the big, enormous problems that we're facing.
In terms of the Trump movement, we played the clip of him saying that Republican turnout is at a record. He said that in the post-Super Tuesday news conference. Republican turnout in these primaries is at a record, and he's coming in first, whereas Democratic turnout is down. I'll get to you on the Democratic turnout in a minute. But what does it say that Republican turnout in the primaries is at a record high?
Well, to a certain extent, he's selectively interpreting. You look at Iowa, where there was very high turnout. What it appears actually happened is a whole lot of Republican voters came out to vote against Trump. And if you look at the polling yesterday, the Real Clear Politics averages prior to the actual voting, Trump underperformed, sometimes by double digits in almost every state. He overperformed in 2 states, I can't remember which 2, but by less than 1%. Whereas Marco Rubio overperformed, despite the fact that he only won 1 state, he overperformed his polling averages in almost every state. So what that suggests is, to the extent that there is record turnout, it's not necessarily turning out the way that Trump is saying.
And on the Democratic side, there is lower Democratic turnout than in 2008. Like some of the analysis has made a big deal of how in South Carolina, Clinton beat Sanders by a greater percentage margin than Obama beat Clinton in 2008, even among African American voters with, the history-making first black president. But there were 200,000 fewer voters.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts there. In 2008 especially, that was a much more robust competition for the nomination, plus you had the historic aspect of the Obama presidency. I mean, so the attention was on the Democrats, much in the same way that the attention is on the Republicans now. But I also do think that there's a problem in terms of enthusiasm that the Democrats have to worry about. Hillary Clinton is not a great candidate. I think that if Trump is the nominee, there'll be a lot of people will vote in opposition to his candidacy. But the Democrats really do have to worry about sort of bolstering the enthusiasm for their candidate.
Ian Tuttle, Bob Herbert, thank you both very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Time for evidence-based politics, where we meet a scholar who has studied an issue oversimplified by campaign rhetoric. The Donald Trump campaign has shocked many, left and right, for growing strong despite or because of his inflammatory rhetoric. Trump said he would embrace waterboarding, bomb countries and take their oil, order mass deportations, indefinitely ban Muslims from immigrating, and censor the media for criticizing public figures. Some have described Trump using the F word, fascist. But is there really anything fascistic about Donald Trump or the way he's campaigning? It's a serious question that's been floating around even before he retweeted that Mussolini quote last week about it being better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. One worried Democratic voter emailed us side-by-side photos like this many months ago. That's Benito on the right. In fact, there's no easy definition of fascism, but one of the hallmarks usually included is the mythic idea of a desperate nation allegedly threatened by outsiders until a great leader comes along. And we do hear some of that.
Our enemies are getting stronger and stronger by the day, and we as a country are getting weaker. Our country needs a truly great leader, and we need a truly great leader now.
Here to explain what fascism is and isn't, and whether to place Donald Trump anywhere near the word, is one of the best-known scholars on the topic, Robert Paxton. He's Professor Emeritus of Social Sciences at Columbia University and author of The Anatomy of Fascism, published in 2004. Welcome.
Thank you.
How do you begin to define the word for those who haven't studied it?
Well, people often try to describe fascism as a list of precepts, as if you were comparing it to liberalism. But fascism was something much more visceral than that. It was a movement based strongly on emotions, designed to restore a nation that was terrified of being weak. It had been defeated in war or perhaps threatened by revolution. In the case of Germany, it was both. And fascism promised to unify people and subordinate individuals to a great national enterprise. It was not individualistic. It was against individualism. And you would mobilize the passions and energies of a nation around the conflict between the enemies. And they're not just external enemies, but internal enemies also. They're enemies inside the fortress.
So far, this is sounding a fair bit like Trump.
Well, there are certainly some similarities. I think there are also some differences.
Tell us about some of the similarities.
Well, the notion that the country is weak and is threatened and is growing weaker and needs a strong leader, that's classical.
The slogan, Make America Great Again?
Yeah, you would say that Hitler said, make Germany great again, and Mussolini said, make Italy great again. It's an exact paraphrase. And then the focus upon enemies, especially internal enemies, and treason within. The notion that you don't have to be too particular about legal observing legality, due process, because of the high cause of restoring the nation. It's legitimate to do some very rough things.
How about the way Trump presents? A lot of people say that he seems like an authoritarian, like he wants to not just do something about the enemies, make America great again. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make your country or keep your country great, but how about the way he presents himself?
Well, an important element of fascism was the projection of an image. Traditional political parties, people made learned speeches and so forth, but with fascism you projected an image. Hitler would arrive by plane. No one had ever seen that before. Trump's doing the same thing. He wants to present the image of himself. He thrusts out his jaw as a man of action and who's willing to do some very tough things.
So let's get to some of the biggest differences that you see between Trump and a classic fascist.
Well, the classic fascist grew out of a very particular time, and that was the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution that burst out in the last days of it. And so a country like Germany was defeated and horribly humiliated, and then it had a very powerful Communist Party. So in 1932, when Hitler was approaching becoming plausible as a leader, the two growing parties were the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, and so Hitler sold himself to the conservatives as the most useful barrier. He never won a majority. They brought him into the tent because he was the one who was fighting the communists in the street, and he was tough enough. Mussolini,
now,
not
let me
too
stop
different.
you for just a second,
Okay.
because there may be a parallel with Trump even in that, at least within the context of the Republican Party. He's not winning a majority of any of these primaries. He's got a fractured party with multiple candidates, and he looks like the alpha dog by winning a third of the vote.
Yes, no, I admit the appeal to overcoming weakness is very definitely parallel. But we do not face a Bolshevik revolution, and he has something of a stretch, I think, to say that this country is on the verge of a socialist revolution. No, he's saying that kind of thing, but I don't think that's very convincing.
And you mentioned individualism before as one of the enemies of fascism.
Yes.
Different than the United States.
Well, this is the Tea Party and not Trump exactly, but they're working together, and the idea is that individualism is the most sacred of our ideals, and you're not supposed to be limited by anything, and the government has no business telling a mine owner that he can't send the miners into a dangerous mine, that we let us have no environmental rules, let us have no workplace rules. And this would be anathema. Hitler accepted the welfare state. He wanted to revive the country without labor unions, to be sure, but nevertheless taking care of everybody.
Well, it seems to me there are both liberal and conservative critiques of individualism in this country. The liberals say they're against materialism and careerism and that kind of thing, and the conservatives don't like lifestyle, sexual individualism, things like that, departing from religious institutions. So there is a critique of individualism on the right. I don't know if it's Trump exactly, but it's there, isn't it?
Yes, of course it's there. But what is not there with Trump, though it might come someday, is the regimentation. The fascists presenting themselves to a people that was distressed by loss. The fascist temptation was joining the Hitler Youth, joining the Wolf Cubs in Italy, joining something, wearing a uniform, marching. I mean, this was enormously healing to a country that has been beaten up on. And there's nothing of that now. I mean, he might someday try that.
What do you think about his followers, though, in that respect? He is drawing these huge crowds.
Yeah, but they're not wearing uniforms, and they're not doing, they're not marching up and down, they're not being regimented. They're enthusiastic, but they're not being regimented.
And this reluctance on the part of Trump to clearly denounce David Duke and white supremacists in the way that Paul Ryan and others just say, there is no room for this in Republican Party America. He says, what, white supremacists? I don't know anything about what. Yeah, okay, you want me to denounce, I'll denounce. It's almost as if he's trying to not alienate a certain part of his base.
Well, I find that very surprising, but he's capable of making terrible gaffes and surviving them because no one who loves him seems to care what he says.
Are they gaffes, or is he doing this whole thing on purpose because he understands history and he understands rhetoric?
Well, I would have thought that group is so small he doesn't need to appeal to them. They're going to vote for him anyway if they vote. I think he's very impulsive, and I think that popped out, but it doesn't seem to hurt him.
Thank you very much for shedding some light on fascism. Thank you.
Okay.
And that's POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour tracking the presidential horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.